Good morning, everybody. Today we'll be discussing the differences between the Pueblo tribes, specifically their architecture and housing, as well as their weaponry. The three tribes we'll be focusing on: the Hopi, Isleta Pueblo, and Taos Pueblo. First, we'll discuss their architecture and the subtle differences between them. First, we will start with the Hopi Pueblos. Oftentimes, they resembled this, of course in better condition, but we are more here to talk about the structural material used. It is most common with the Hopi Pueblo, along with several other Pueblos that lived along or near the mesas or on top. They primarily used stone brick, either quarried sandstone or other stones. Either from the mesa below, they would quarry it and bring it to the top, shaping it into rudimentary bricks. It is something in the method it's called dry stacking. During this dry stacking, they would incorporate mud and clay mortar. The mixture was primarily made of sand and dirt, along with clay, to keep everything bound together, as well as plastered on top with simple clay plaster, or adobe plaster. It helped keep the bones of the structure together without the stone bricks eroding due to rain or overall weather and temperature shifts. It is a truly ingenious way to construct houses, and this is what a lot of the Pueblo structures that are still standing today resemble. Often a lot of the mortar and plaster fell away due to time, but the main structure still remains. It is a really interesting piece of architecture and how Pueblo society adapted to their local environment. Now let's move on to their cousins down in the valley. This is the Isleta Pueblo style of housing. As you can see, it looks quite similar. Before the introduction of wood brick molds from the Spanish, they used a method primarily called puddle adobe. How this was done: instead of using stone brick, there was a heavy reliance on using mud, straw, and available grasses in combination with clay. What they would do is they would lay the first half of the wall down, about 10 to 20 inches. They would have to let it dry and harden before laying the next layer. This is primarily done layer by layer, forming a thick wall, which is good for insulation, and unlike the Hopi Pueblos, they do not rely on clay plaster. Oftentimes, the buildings took this little bit misformed shape here, but ultimately they serve their purpose. It is a truly smart way the Isleta Pueblo and several other Pueblos along the Rio Grande. This was quite common for the tribes that did not have access to stone or heavy timber. Last but not least, Taos Pueblo. As you can see, it has a bit of a resemblance to Isleta and the other Pueblos, but the major difference is its height and stories. Due to the readily available access to timber, it allowed them to combine the puddled adobe method along with extra wooden support columns, allowing more structural integrity and the ability to build higher into the air. The best thing to akin it to is apartment style. It is one of the things that Puebloan tribes pride themselves on. Oftentimes, other Pueblo villages can go up to 3 to 4 stories, but over in Taos Pueblo, due to the access to local timbers and woods, more easily available than the Hopi or the Sardana Pueblo. Due to this, it allowed them to build their structures 6 to 7 stories tall, a true feat of engineering for the time. Now let's move on and discuss the differences between the Pueblo weapons between the Sardana Pueblo, the Hopi Pueblo, and Taos Pueblo. First, starting with the differences between bows. Here is an example of a Hopi bow. This is just an example. There was many different styles of Hopi bows, but the most common were the simple self bows. They were primarily made from either juniper or nearby local shrub woods due to the lack of more suitable woods for bow making, and how they solved their problem with the lack of decent quality wood. They would do something called sinew back. Sinew back is having animal tendons glued to the back of the bow, giving it more tension and strength and more resistance to snapping, as well as when the arrow would fire, it would give a satisfying crack. And now let's take a look at another common Pueblo weapon, the stone-headed war club. These are common amongst the Pueblos. This is of course just an example. You have different styles of stone-headed war clubs: the circular river stones, the more pointed angled stones, and the sharper blade stones, as well as you have wood knot war clubs. It truly ran the gambit between the Pueblo tribes due to what they had available, but they all shared a common weapon like this. Of course, in combination with stone tools such as axes, adze, and digging sticks in a pinch they would use as weaponry. But this is one of the more common variants of the war clubs that were seen around the Pueblo tribes. Let's look at the different styles of arrows that were common amongst the Pueblos. Oftentimes, obsidian, flint, or bone-tipped arrows were common, but due to the introduction of metal and other materials, kettle-tipped arrow points and other style of metal arrow points and repurposed metal points started to come about more and more. But this is not the main focus. Let's talk about the arrow shafts in particular. Such found in the Sandias were reed arrow shafts with a wooden foreshaft. towards the end or the back of the arrow to have a more steadier flight. It is believed that the reed arrows that the Sandias made were the most fastest flying arrows within the Southwest. It is due to the lightweight nature of reed arrows. Of course, they'd be fitted with a wooden forepoint to help keep its shape during flight. And now, let's take a look at Taos Pueblo weaponry. Taos Pueblo is a very interesting case. Oftentimes, their weaponry resembles a lot of the Great Plains due to the proximity of their Great Plains brothers, but their weapons closely resemble those of the Comanche, the Apache, as well as the Kiowa and other Plains Indians. And one of their more interesting adoptions, other than the shorter bows of the Plain Indian style, was the lances. These lances were common with Plains Indians, mainly due to horse culture and their open terrain, but they were adapted by Pueblo people mainly due to prevent and help against raids and overall utility. But specifically, the Plains Indian lance was more common with Taos Pueblo than the rest of the Puebloan tribes. It is one of the more interesting adaptations, mainly due to the influence of their nomadic neighbors. It is intriguing that these subtle differences exist between the Pueblo tribes. It is one of those interesting things that is not widely spoken about or taught about, even though they're extremely subtle and small details, but they are very important. It shows that the true ingenuity of the Pueblo people, as well as the influence the neighboring tribes had on the Puebloan people. And it goes to show they weren't all one united group, as sometimes they're all lumped into, as with the overarching title of the Pueblo tribes or the Pueblo peoples. Yes, they shared the same housing style and perhaps even shared the same religion, but of course they had their differences and different spiritual beliefs and practices, along with their adaptations to their environments were drastically different once you look a little bit closer. So I do hope you have learned something here today. Again, thank you very much, and I do hope you enjoyed.